Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Statistics Solutions on Chapter 5, the discussion. Just a few things before we get started. We have a support person on with us who can, answer your questions that are not related to the content. So you can type questions in the chat box, and that person can answer questions as we go along about non-content related issues. You can type questions to me as we proceed about content. That's fine, but I won't get to them until the end. Also, let's see, everybody will be receiving a copy of the presentation as well, the slides and the audio component. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, just a few, before we get kind of into the meat of it, just kind of a few things to think about as you move on toward your discussion. First of all, congratulations. If you're at this stage now, maybe some of you are kind of just looking ahead, and that's fine too. But if you got this far, then congratulations. It's a big step. One of the first things I'll say is just generally, be happy, good, glad you're here. It's an accomplishment. But the kind of risk that some people have, fall into, or the kind of trap they fall into when they get to chapter 5, is they want to rush the chapter. And that's understandable. You've been working hard, you may be tired of your study, and you just want to get it through. You don't want to pay for another semester. All those things are completely understandable. I would just advise, though, to kind of slow down, take a breath, not rush the chapter. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't have a sense of urgency and have dates and timelines, but rushing it could actually be counterproductive, and sometimes it is. Sometimes people want to rush, and that leads to mistakes, or it leads to your chair looking at it and then turning the document back around to you and say, hey, we need more here, being underdeveloped, which of course sometimes it depends on how long it takes your chair to get back to you, can throw extra time into it. So my first kind of general piece of advice is just to kind of settle down and take do what you need to do to write, to approach the chapter 5 in a way, again, that might have a sense of urgency, but you don't want to just kind of rush it and just kind of give it a short shrift. So having said that, there's numerous resources, at your fingertips, with the internet these days, your internet, your university library. So there are resources on, how to write discussion chapters. They're out there. Avail yourself of them. There's resources like this, webinars. We also have templates and resources on our website. We're happy to share some of those with you if you check our website. The other thing is get your school's template. If your school has a template they want you to follow. The contents for discussion chapters are pretty similar generally, across schools. Having said that, though, some schools will have, particulars, they'll want a different sequence of headers, or they'll want specific headers. So always follow your school's template. It's also good to have an approved dissertation from your school in a similar area as an example. Because you'll see when you sit down and you start to write it, you can go to webinars, you can read resources, you can get advice. But when you sit down to write it, it's, all of a sudden that this stuff doesn't make sense, or things aren't clicking in your mind. So it's always really helpful to have a sample. or somebody's dissertation who's they've approved dissertation that's done it. So you can see what they've actually put down and how they've handled some of these sections. Okay, so let's dive in here. Chapter 5, discussion chapter. So this is the contents, typically. Introduction, interpretation of the findings, limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for further research, summary. Some of these things may be slightly changed, the titles may be slightly different, but the contents are pretty standard for the discussion. And again, if your school has a specific template they want you to follow that. Okay, so the introduction, just like the introduction of any other chapter, really the purpose is just to kind of reorient the reader about what's going on. So it's always helpful to restate your purpose, restate the purpose of your study, remind the reader of the importance of the study, why it was needed to be conducted, remind them of essentially of your research problem. And if you want to end the section, you can, by previewing the contents of what's going to be in the chapter, you can do that. This chapter will contain, discussion of the interpretation of the findings and list the other sections. Okay, so the interpretation of the findings section, again, sometimes this is called discussion. I know that's odd, but within the discussion chapter. But generally something like interpretation of the findings. It's where you discuss your findings and you specifically discuss your findings in relation to the findings of previous research. I mean, that's really the heart of the chapter, and it's what your practical and your recommendations for future research are going to be based on. So this is really the central focus of the chapter. And interpretation really means, it sounds like, great, you get to interpret your findings, I get to say what I want about them. Well, not really. The big part here is to start a discussion of your findings, but in relation to previous research found in chapter 2. Okay, so, and the best way to kind of section this section out, to have subsections, is to, if it's quantitative, structure it by research questions or hypotheses. If it's qualitative, structure it by your themes. And this is, it's not only reader friendly, right? Because as readers, we like, chunks of text, not just single blocks of chunks of text with headers, right? So it sections material out for us, but it's also going to help you as a writer, because if you start talking about all your findings together, you're going to get confused. You're going to confuse your reader. So section it out, make subheaders. Summarize or restate your RQs, or restate your themes if it's qualitative. Summarize what you found, and then you want to go back to chapter 2. You want to bring in whatever area it is that you're talking about, whatever research question, the variables, the theme. Go back to your chapter 2, see what people have found in that area, researchers have found in that area. Can people still hear me? I got a message that my internet connection is unstable. Okay. Tie your findings back into major findings from the literature review. And you want to note where, specifically where your findings confirm or don't confirm the findings of previous research. So here's what I found. You lay out your finding, you summarize it. However, my findings do not support the findings of Smith, who found, or maybe they did support previous findings, those of Jones, who found. Okay, get as close to your studies you can. If there's previous research on your topic, but they didn't quite do what you did, I mean, that's fine. Just get as close as you can. The idea is to have something to relate your findings to. Therefore, after that, you can make conclusions about what you found. If your findings agree generally with previous research, then you can make a conclusion about whatever it is that you studied. If you examined the relationship between two factors or two variables, and your findings confirm the findings of previous research that these factors are indeed related, you can make a conclusion about that. If your findings do not support previous research, that's fine. Sometimes people freak out. I didn't find any significance, or my findings are different than previous research. That's fine. It just suggests that there's some inconclusiveness in that area, right? Previous research shows this. However, your research showed something else. And in that case, if your findings are different in a certain area than previous research, it's usually appropriate to offer an explanation. Now, this is nothing you're going to be able to prove, but this is just something that may help to explain why your findings may have been different. Sometimes it has to do with the population. Maybe you had a different sample, right? Different people. Maybe your study, maybe it's based on a limitation. Maybe your study was underpowered. But you should offer some kind of explanation of why your findings, if they don't support or different. Also, if anything was unexpected, or you find something that's novel, especially like in qualitative studies that are sometimes meant to explore topics, and you find new things, those definitely deserve to be mentioned and deserve discussion. Okay, and for each subsection, for each research question or hypothesis, for each theme, just repeat this. Right, so you have several subsections within this section. Limitations, this can either be a separate section on its own, or sometimes people just kind of put it at the end of the discussion section or the interpretation section, either one. And again, if your school has a template, you're going to be tired of me saying that. Follow your school's template. So limitations are just any kind of shortcomings or any kind of weaknesses that may have affected your results. Probably in the proposal, either in chapters 1 or chapter 3, or in both, you probably had limitations, discuss limitations a little bit, like what might have been at that time, what you thought may have been limitations, like a forward-looking thing. Now, this is, now that you've conducted the study, what actually did end up being a limitation. So a good place to start is go back to those earlier limitations that you talked about, see what, if any of those actually turned out to be a limitation. And then if there were any limitations, that you didn't mention that may have affected results, you want to discuss those. And the idea is that you have your results, but if they were influenced by something, you want, it's just kind of, you want to be clear about that. And a big limitation, for example, for quantitative studies is low sample size. If you have a low sample size, your study is underpowered, that affects the statistical certainty of your results. For qualitative studies, researcher bias is always a potential limitation. So you may want to mention that and mention any kind of steps you took to mitigate or to prevent researcher bias. Also, usually in the limitation section, schools want you to talk about the generalizability of your findings. And just kind of in a nutshell, what that means is, can we take your findings and will they generalize to the larger target population? Typically, if you have an adequately powered quantitative study, and sometimes has to do with recruitment. If you have like a fairly representative sample and you have an adequate number of participants, your findings should generalize pretty well. If your study was underpowered, that's going to decrease how well your findings generalize. Also, for qualitative studies, it's a little tricky. I mean, it's easy, it's fairly easy to address, but for qualitative studies, they're not designed. The results are not designed to generalize, because qualitative studies by nature they have low sample sizes. They're designed to get in-depth information from a small sample of people. Usually, like if you're doing interviews, 10 people, you've interviewed them to get that kind of in-depth, deep knowledge that you cannot get with quantitative studies. So probably just a mention of that is needed, that the results of this qualitative study will not generalize well to the larger target population, but they're not intended to. Okay, they're intended to give you in-depth information. So it's kind of, should we say, just kind of an accepted limitation of qualitative studies, but it's worth mentioning. Implications for practice, and this is just like it sounds. For people at the level of practice and what you do, if you're in education, what does it tell us? What is the data? What you found? How can that inform? If it's education, let's say it might have important information for teachers. It might have important information for administrators, right? So, if you had to tell somebody, hey, what did you find? And you tell them what you found. Well, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for somebody who works in that area? What would you tell them? And you can get specific here, nuts and bolts. If something shows we need more professional development of teachers or something, just off the top of my head, what would that look like? Does that mean, we give teachers, set aside extra money so they can go to more conferences? Does it mean professional development, like right on the school campus, in the form of seminars, in the form of workshops? So you can get kind of nuts and bolts specific about practice, but again, it should be based on what you found. Recommendations for further research, again, exactly like it sounds, but it should be based on your findings and to some degree, a lesser degree, sometimes on limitations. So to take the easy one first, limitations, the idea would be that if, say, you conducted a quantitative study, it was underpowered, you had too few participants, you would just recommend replicating your study, but just ensuring that future researchers had an adequate sample size. Excuse me. The same with any limitation. If you make a recommendation for future research based on your limitations, the idea is to replicate your study, and future researchers would just address whatever happened to be a limitation in your study. Findings based on, recommendations based on your findings. If you found something new or unexpected, that would certainly warrant more investigation. If your findings in some important areas, they did not support previous research, that suggests inconclusiveness in that area. So you can, generally recommend more research in that area. You can recommend different types of research. Again, if you found something new or novel, you might want to recommend qualitative research on it, so researchers can explore it more. You might want, for some reason, you might want to recommend a case study, which is kind of a local study at a specific site or a couple sites, and it involves different kinds of sources of data, like several sources of data. And that really helps, give you more like a comprehensive sense of the topic or whatever you're studying. So it can be based on your findings, or again, different types of studies to get different types of data. And the summary, again, check with your school's template. Some schools just let you end after recommendations for future research. If your school does want a summary, I mean, it does what other summaries do, just recap the major points from the chapter. But the big thing here is, because it's also the end of your whole study, you want to leave the reader with a take-home message, the most important points about your study and your findings that you want them to remember. Okay, and this is our contact information, what we do. And again, you'll be getting a copy of this, and we do have additional resources on the website. So that's worth kind of looking around and seeing what we have and what might work for you. Okay, let's see, I have a couple of questions here. I'm going to handle those. Let's see. In this section, only for the researcher's words, or can any of the quoted one-on-one interview be used? Okay, I'm assuming you're talking about, let's see, such as anything from the interviews that didn't quite fit into the data analysis section. Okay, if I'm reading that right, it sounds like, I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. When you're talking about the interpretation of the findings of the discussion section, sounds like you're talking about qualitative research. Can you bring in words from interviewees? And it also seems like you want to try to bring in a point that's maybe not a theme. It didn't quite fit into the themes, but it's a point you want to bring up anyway. A couple of things here. First of all, if you have a qualitative study and you're in the interpretation of the finding sections, you can use quotes from your participants. That's fine. I would use them sparingly to help you make points, to help support your points that you're making. I think that's fine. The risk is, and the temptation is, for people to quote too much. So they want to fill space. So they have a half a page of a participant's quote. Avoid that. I mean, professors can see what that is. That's filling space up. But if you need to bring in a participant quote to help make a point, that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, it really helps. But again, you don't, just do it when it's necessary. Also, I think the other part of the question here is, I may be misinterpreting it, but it sounds like, say you have a qualitative study, you found 5 themes, but you want to make a point about something else that came up. How do you fit that in there? My advice is, if it didn't rise to the level of being a theme, then it's probably not important enough to mention. So, I mean, I'm not a qualitative results person, so I don't know a lot about the coding, but if it's something that you think is interesting, but like one person brought it up, I don't think that would make it, it wouldn't rise to the theme level of importance. I mean, I would just handle that on a case-by-case basis. My sense is to leave it out if it's important to you, but it didn't seem to be a theme that your participants, most of them were talking about. You can put it in if you do. I mean, just have a discussion about it and why it's important, or try to, argue why you still think it's important to include. And again, your chair, ask your chair, too. I mean, you could ask your chair's advice. My sense is to leave it out, but I've seen people put points like that in, and it's worked, so it can work. And again, if you have, your chair might say, hey, leave it in, or your chair might say, hey, take it out. So you can go with that too. Let's see, a couple other questions here. Are limitations like underpowered sample size something that would make your committee take pause and not pass you during your defense? Is this something you should go back and refine in the future if you work toward turning your dissertation into a monograph? Yeah, if you conducted the study and it was underpowered, you're not going to sneak it past your methodologist. I mean, it's in there. If you conducted a power analysis, your people are going to know. When you have it in there, what the power analysis showed, you're not going to sneak it by anybody, especially your methods person. So the idea is to just acknowledge it. It's not, and it doesn't make everything suspect. It doesn't make your study's no good. It just means it could have influenced your results. It means your results don't have the statistical certainty that they would have if the study was powered. So it casts some doubt, but it doesn't make everything irrelevant either. But it's something you need to acknowledge. In fact, trying to sneak it past, would probably get you in more trouble than, I don't mean trouble, but sneaking it past, trying to sneak it past is probably worse than just, than going ahead and admitting it. I mean, if it's there, it's there. Is it something that's going to work against you in publication? Hard to say. I mean, it could, but again, I think you conducted the study, in good faith, and you just for whatever reason you couldn't get the participants. You just admitted it. Again, it doesn't make your data relevant. It just says you don't have to really kind of have the statistical certainty that you might have if you would have had a larger sample. If you're doing qualitative research, must you organize it by theme? That is, are quantitative and qualitative necessarily set up differently? I don't think you have to. And again, I'm going to go back to the check your template. There's nothing that says that you have to organize the interpretation section if it's qualitative by theme, but it just seems a handy way to organize it. Like you already have the themes, right? Here's this theme, here's this theme, here's this theme. It's already kind of like a de facto organizing principle, it would seem to me. You don't have to, but you should have some way that the literature, I mean, or the material flows together. And that seems to be a pretty handy kind of organizational structure to go for. Or quantitative and qualitative necessarily set up differently. Yeah, I mean, you could just organize it by research question, like quantitative section would be. But sometimes you may, like qualitative studies, sometimes only have like one research question. So, a theme seems to me to be pretty standard. If you have questions, like more in-depth questions, you could ask your chair. But that's kind of what I would recommend. How do these sections of a dissertation correlate to areas of a journal publication? Is it better to rework your dissertation to monograph or article? Yeah, if you have your dissertation, you're thinking about publishing it. Yeah, the sections are going to be different, and you're just going to have to get the guidelines, whatever journal that you're targeting, they will have specific guidelines. You're just going to have to get those guidelines, see what they are, and shape your material accordingly. And one of the big things is that you're going to have to cut like serious content. I mean, dissertations are long, journal articles are, really reduced comparatively. So some things are out. The lit review usually gets really reduced. Usually there's not a lot of rewriting, but you may have to shape, paragraphs to kind of fit in what the journal's looking for. But you just have to get the guidelines of the journal. The sections may be a little different, but they generally should correspond to what's the problem, what's the background research, the method, the results, the discussion. They should generally correspond to the chapters, although the sections may be different. Okay, let me see, just double check if we have more questions. And limitations, if we mention something like we have not able to include sample size, does it impact the strength of the results? Yeah, I mean, we kind of covered that a little bit. An underpowered quantitative study, it reduces your statistical certainty. I mean, and that's kind of my layman's terms because I don't know really how else to say it, but yeah, it does. Again, it doesn't make things irrelevant. It just says that the results are not as statistically certain as they would be if you were to have an adequately powered sample, adequate number of participants in the sample. Let me see, I'm just going through the questions, make sure I got them all covered. If basic demographics are not part of the theme, do they need to be reviewed or summarized without noting any discussion? That's a good question. So basic demographic information, yeah, if it's not part of what you analyzed, usually, I mean, if you don't need to discuss demographics in the discussion chapter, if they weren't part of what you were actually analyzing. However, if something pops out that's really surprising, you can include it. If there's something that's really just like, wow, that's different, or that's unexpected, or that's unusual. Yeah, you can include it, because anything you mention in the discussion chapter, you're going to have to discuss. So, if you mention something and you just kind of like drop it in there, hey, wasn't this interesting? And you don't follow up, people are going to be like, well, why'd you mention it? So just keep that in mind. Anything that you put in the discussion chapter like that, there should be a reason and there should be a discussion of it. But generally demographics, if there's nothing special about them and they're not part of your analysis, you don't need to discuss them. I think I covered everything. Let me just double check. Which section of your dissertation should be the longest? It's hard to say, but my guess that probably the longest one consistently is the lit review. Some schools have page requirements for the lit review. Some schools don't. Some schools say like 30 pages. Some schools say like 20 to 30. Usually the sweet spot for lit reviews is 25 to 30 pages. I've seen lit reviews that are longer than that. So usually, unless there's, you have a lot of analyses, your results chapters can be long. If there's a lot of analyses, it can be short if there's not. But I would say typically the lit review is the longest. I am revising my methodology chapter qualitative. What can I do in this phase of my study to better prepare for the discussion? Nothing really. You know, if you don't have your results yet, there's nothing really to do for the discussion chapter. I mean, it's always, I think it's nice to know to get a holistic sense, like to pull back and get a holistic sense of the dissertation of a whole, and to see where the discussion chapter like fits in, like how it's the end piece, and it's the place where you can make claims and conclusions and discuss your research in relation to previous research. It's just nice to know how the pieces fit together. So I would just say at this point, you know, if you're still in your methodology chapter, yeah, there's nothing to do to anticipate the chapter 5, but just to kind of understand how it, you know, it fits into the overall project, that, you know, it is where you will discuss your results, and you discuss them in relation to previous research. You make recommendations based on that, for practice and for further research. So sometimes just to see how it's part of the overall picture and our overall puzzle is sometimes helpful. If basic, okay, all right, I get that one. All right, any other questions? I think I covered them all. Okay, will you have a webinar on methodology? Okay, good questions. Yeah, we do run, just check our calendar, check our website, check our calendar. We run webinars on every chapter, the introduction chapter, the lit review, methodology chapter, results, and the discussion. And also some specialized webinars on, like, you know, research questions, research design. So just check our calendar, but we do run webinars on other components of the dissertation. Okay, great. Doesn't look like we have any more questions. I'm going to let you go, but remember there's our resources. Yep, and there's upcoming webinars right there. We have resources on our there's website. Your library has resources. You know, they're out there. Avail yourself of them. Talk to your chair, you know, get as much help as you can from your chair. Moving forward, use templates, use examples, get examples. Chapter 5 is just a little tricky, but once you get your head around what it's asking for, you know, it goes quicker than the proposal stuff. There's still work to do. I'm not saying you're out of the woods, but you're on the downhill slope. And again, just kind of resist it, be happy, you know, be motivated, just kind of resist the urge to rush it. You should do well. Great. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I'll let you go, and good luck, and be safe. Thank you.